everyone. Welcome to Cities on the Frontline. My name is Francis Guesquier. I'm the practice manager for the urban development and disaster risk management practice for the East Asia region of the World Bank. Today's topic is assessing risk and data-driven decision-making. We have two very interesting speakers, two very good friends that actually Lauren will introduce in a minute. But before we start, let me, as always, remind everyone of the intention of this speaker series and the ground rule for the conversation today. The purpose of these global webinars is to have open and honest learning conversation between practitioners in cities and government and partners supporting these entities. The calls are not on the record, and we ask that you not attribute any comments made unless you have the person's express permission to do so, and we're happy to help put you in touch or obtain this permission. We have more than 400 registered participants today, so to facilitate the discussion, we ask that you use the Q&A function to ask questions. The speakers will speak for about 30 minutes and then have time for Q&A. So please note that also that the recording of the session as well as the PowerPoint presentation will be posted online on Monday, so you'll have access to all the material. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you so much, Francis, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's wonderful to be back here with the Cities on the Frontline community again for a very exciting session tonight. So tonight we are going to be diving deeply into how we use state-of-the-art hazard modeling tools to reduce risk through land use, zoning, and urban design, and how we really engage different types of groups in resilience dialogue to evaluate risk and risk reduction and policy options that we can take. We're going to be hearing from two very dynamic practitioners in an academic and then also in a city setting who are looking at mapping and designing these kind of resilient infrastructure networks and looking at how you really knit together emergency preparedness, social justice, and climate response. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce, as Francis said, two very good friends and colleagues of both the World Bank and the Resilient Cities Network. First tonight, we are going to be hearing from David Lallement, who is the head of the Disaster Analytics for Society Lab here in Singapore at NTU. And he focuses on quantifying the evolution of risk in cities driven by climate change. And particular patterns of urban growth and changing vulnerability. He works with many governments and non-governmental agencies, including the Red Cross and many financing institutions. Before NTU, he was in the US at Stanford University, where he was a researcher and founder of the Stanford University Urban Resilience Initiative. Then we'll be hearing from Katja Tynan, who is the Manager of Resilience and Disaster Risk Reduction for the City of Vancouver. And Katja is overseeing the implementation of Resilient Vancouver, which is the resilience strategy of the city that's structured around three pillars: thriving and prepared neighborhoods, proactive and collaborative city government, and safe and adaptive buildings and infrastructure. Before she joined the city, Katja was working in the nonprofit sector, doing community development for organizations serving marginalized communities. And also she worked with arts and culture organizations. So we're really glad to have both of them with us tonight. And we are going to be hearing from David first. So David, I'm going to turn the screen and the microphone over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you very much, Francis. All right, I'm going to share screen. All right, is this working? Yes, all right, great. Well, I'm very happy to be here and share with you some of the work that we've been doing on assessing risk through data-driven decision-making. And specifically, I'll be focusing on some of the tools that we've been working to develop. All right, so as a bit of an introduction, as Lauren said, I'm the head of the Disaster Analytics for Society Lab at Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. And also a principal investigator at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. I know you'll be seeing the logo on the slides for that. Before that, I was at Stanford, where I founded the Stanford Urban Resilience Initiative. And before that, I worked actually with Francis Guesquier at the World Bank and GFDRR in several countries. And yet before that, I grew up in northern Thailand. Our house was along the river. This is my mom and little sister, and we experienced flooding quite regularly. So this is something that I've been interested in and impacted by for a very long time. So I wanted to start with the kind of risk analysis framework, which you all know and love, and I'm sure are very familiar with. So as you know, I'm going to see if I can do a pointer here. Other pointer there. So risk we've defined as the combination of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And specifically by combination, we mean convolution. That's this weird symbol here. What that means mathematically, and as an academic, I can't let you get away with without seeing an equation, but this is going to be the only one, and it's a pretty simple one. But this convolution comes down to convolution means a probabilistic integral. And what it is the probability of a consequence given an event times the rate of that event. And then we do that for all event sizes, okay? And we'll come back to this later. So what did this look like for flood risk? For instance, we have the hazard that's described, the hazard rate, as a curve of frequency versus flood magnitude. We have the exposure, which defines the number of homes or roads that are impacted by the flood, and then vulnerability is the propensity of the assets to be damaged due to flood with increasing depth. And then we put all this together into risk, and we defined risk as this curve which describes the loss and the probability of exceeding that loss. And these curves usually look like this. So this framework has been incredibly effective and powerful in helping us manage disaster risk over the past few decades. And specifically, it underpins pretty much all of the insurance and risk transfer products. It's also what we use to understand the reliability of our infrastructure, which then turns into building codes for earthquake safety or other types of safety. And increasingly, we can use this to do cost-benefit analysis for disaster risk management. So I think we have actually a lot to celebrate, and there's a lot of things that we've been doing quite well for a long time. Urban risk management has a long history. I was talking to my group earlier about how cities no longer kind of burn completely anymore. This used to be a regular thing where cities would disappear completely because they would burn. But that's an issue that we've mostly addressed very successfully. And we've been doing this as well since much before climate change was an issue. So I wanted to highlight we do already have some useful tools. But in my view, actually, in some ways, these tools have reached some limits. And that's what I'm going to be focusing my presentation on today. And specifically, I want to look at a few paradigm shifts that I think are needed in this way of thinking about risk. And I'll be presenting some tools that at least we've been working on and some others have been working on to promote and support better decision-making for risk reduction, specifically in cities. So the first paradigm shift that's needed has to do with accounting for climate change. And if we come back here to the risk framework, the issue is that this term right here, which describes the hazard rate, a fundamental assumption of that is that it doesn't change in time. And the rates of flooding in the past are representative of what they will be in the future. And clearly with climate change, we know that that's not true. And that poses a big issue for the application of this framework. The other has to do with the fact that cities change very rapidly. I currently live here in Singapore, and Singapore today looks nothing like it did 20 years ago. And that's true of many cities around the world. Urbanization is still ongoing at an incredibly rapid pace. And the impact that has on our risk framework, once again, is that exposure and vulnerability are constantly changing. And there's nothing here in this equation that enabled us to easily address that, or to understand it, or to try to predict it. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that up till now, a lot of these tools have been driven by interest in understanding risk today. And in particular, a lot of the insurance industry, which has funded and promoted a lot of this technological development, really care about risk in the next 5 years, because that's how they develop their products, is kind of on these short time span. And within that time span, I think it's a fair assumption that risk does not change very much. But city decision makers are trying to make decisions and planning infrastructure, which will still be there in 50 years and possibly 100 years. So they need a much longer horizon of understanding of risk in order to make these decisions. So this is exactly what our group has been working on for quite a while now. And specifically, we're trying to develop dynamic probabilistic risk frameworks, which would enable us to, on the one hand, account for the time-varying hazards, mostly driven by climate change, but other patterns as well. Or urban subsidence is a big issue that will change hazards as well. And we can also account for uncertainty in that. That's where the term probabilistic is in there for. We've also been looking at urban growth simulations to get at least a first-order approximation of plausible future expansions of cities and plausible future exposure. And finally, also looking at time-dependent vulnerability to see as well how the vulnerability of our infrastructure is also not necessarily constant. And ultimately, we do this because we want to be able to produce something like this. There's this beautiful quote by Lao Tzu: if you don't change directions, you may end up where you're heading. So we're trying to develop tools for that firstly tell us where we're heading so that we can change directions. And I think that's actually very empowering to municipal decision makers and policymakers, because it's very hard to address existing risk. When something is already built, it's incredibly expensive to retrofit or to protect. It's much easier to address future risk if you know what that will be and if you know how your policies will impact that future risk. So that's what we're trying to do with this tool. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the issue of extreme events. So I look at this in the context of Singapore naturally, because Singapore is correctly quite a resilient city. But that also means that perhaps one thing it's concerned about is these kind of black swan events, things that perhaps it had never seen before and doesn't expect. So we've been trying to think about how that can be addressed. And the premise here is that actually most of our understanding of risks and our models of risk are built from this region of the hazard, like the frequent events. But there's increasing evidence that loss is driven by the extreme events, not the frequent events. And if you look here, if this is kind of a representation of perhaps the development trajectory of a city or region, for most frequent events, the city might recover. What we're really concerned about are these events that might lead the city to a completely different trajectory. So that's what we're concerned with. And our risk framework doesn't enable us to do that, in particular because we don't understand what's called kind of the long tail events. This part of the hazard, we really don't have a good understanding of. And that gets propagated to a lack of understanding of extreme risk. But when you put this on a curve and then you integrate the curve, because it's a very low probability, usually it kind of disappears. But in fact, for cities, this really matters. Like, what are the events that could impact the city so much that it will change forever? So one of the tools that we've been using is counterfactual thinking. And the idea there is that what's challenging about black swan events is almost by definition, they're hard to imagine. You don't know where to start. It's supposedly something you've never seen before. But what we're doing instead is actually we start from an event that actually has happened, a true event, but we try to look at how changes in that event can lead to much worse consequences. And we do this incrementally, to try to see if we can identify black swan events, potential black swan events this way. And specifically, we're looking at changes that might be just random. So for instance, we did a study where we reanalyzed the eruption from Mount Pinatubo in 1991. And that was a volcanic eruption in the Philippines, about 3,000 kilometers from Singapore. And a bit of ash did fall on Singapore. And part of the narrative is that there was a typhoon that was happening at the same time. And it's the typhoon that blew the ash to Singapore. Well, actually, if we reanalyze this 5 days earlier when there was no typhoon, so the same eruption, just different wind conditions because it was 5 days earlier, we see that there was a lot more ash that would have fallen in Singapore. So we're using kind of this idea to explore and build many, many more lessons learned from past events, not only looking at what did happen, but what alternative events could have equally likely have happened. We're also flipping this on its side and thinking about consequence-driven risk analysis. So typically, rather than going from, typically we would go from hazard to impacts. Now we're asking, well, what are the events that could lead to these particular impacts? So for instance, we're looking at how close and large would an earthquake have to be to Singapore to exceed the design code standards. And we're starting to work with cities to use this approach, which we're calling consequence-driven analysis, to develop scenarios for consequences that are absolutely unacceptable to them. So they define what those consequences are, and then we look at the events that could lead to that, and we can plan kind of scenarios around that. I also wanted to talk about the need to celebrate and reward avoided disasters. And here again, the issue is that no one actually experiences this curve. What people experience, what cities experience, is a point on the curve, a particular event, a particular loss. And that's the point against which they get judged, which makes it really hard because for disaster risk managers, that means that if you do everything correctly, nothing happens. And so it's completely invisible, it's unnoticed. And if something does happen, even if you did make good proactive decision making, you still get judged by the fact that something did happen, even if it could have been much, much worse had those actions not been conducted. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to systematize the analysis of good decision making and trying to use, once again, this time a probabilistic upward counterfactual. So rather than searching for worse events, we try to explore, we try to think about, well, what would have happened had we not made this disaster risk management intervention, in order to highlight some of the successes and try to learn from them. So this is an upcoming publication in the Global Assessment Report, if you are interested in that. Ultimately, we want to be able to see this much, much more often, right? That the mayor of San Francisco saves 10,000 lives probabilistically through an earthquake safety program. We don't have to wait till the earthquake to celebrate the lives saved. We can use counterfactual probabilistic analysis to do so immediately and incentivize this type of decision making. Okay, and finally, I want to talk very briefly about also ways that we can start including issues of equity, or more importantly, inequity, and try to address them through our risk models. And once again, our risk framework doesn't enable us to do that because if you look at this curve, the accounting of risk is based on assets, not on the services derived from those assets. So if you have $100 of loss, that is the same if it's $100 and you're a millionaire or $100 and you're a subsistence farmer. Even if we know in reality that's a big difference, because the value of that has for those different people is very different. But that's not accounted for in these tools. So actually, this is work that the World Bank has been spearheading, and I encourage you all to read this publication, Unbreakable, where they try to shift the focus from asset loss to well-being loss as a much better metric to promote actually more equitable outcomes in disaster risk management. And there's other publications by the same authors on this topic. We've been also doing some of this work with a focus on post-disaster recovery for now, where we're trying to improve the way that we measure impacts of disasters. Right now, it's focused very much on understanding the damage that the disaster causes as a metric for impact. But we know that for the same reasons, it's a very coarse metric. So we have this collaboration looking at Nepal and the post-disaster reconstruction, post-earthquake reconstruction in Nepal, to try to build these tools that go beyond building damage to try to understand needs better. Okay, so in summary, I think there's a need to adapt the tools that we use to promote better kind of long-term decision-making to build resilient societies and cities. And I've described a few paradigm shifts that I think are needed in the way that we understand and conduct risk analysis, specifically so that we can have a much longer horizon of view of risk. And I've also described a few of the tools that our group and others are trying to develop for cities. I was only able to go in, well, not much detail at all into any one of these, but I would really encourage you, if you want to learn more, to check out our group website. I work with very brilliant scientists in my group, which you see here. And you can also contact me by email if you have any questions or if you want to work together or think together. And a lot of this work is supported by the National Science Foundation of Singapore. So thank you to them as well. And that is all I had. Stop sharing screen.
Thank you, David. And I think you've drawn out a lot of topics that are going to come back to us in the discussion about how to shift what we're looking at in terms of the probabilistic predictions, how we can celebrate successes and avoided loss rather than waiting until disasters happen. And I'm sure there's going to be more questions on how to do that most effectively and where it's happening effectively. And in that vein, I really want to turn it over to Katya to take us down to the city level to the work that she's doing. Katya, the screen and microphone are yours.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And I'm really glad David went first because I'm going to echo a few things that he said in very eloquent ways. So hi, everyone. My name is Katya Tynan. I'm the Manager of Resilience and Disaster Risk Reduction for the City of Vancouver. And I'm going to be speaking for a few minutes about what Vancouver is kind of learning and exploring around resilience, risk, and decision-making in the municipal context. So I want to start by saying Vancouver does not have all the answers. We have not figured all of this out. And I certainly haven't figured all of this out, but I'm going to share with you at least how we are approaching some of these themes and topics right now in hopes that it might support some of the work that you're doing. So first of all, when we start projects in Vancouver or programs or policy work around resilience, there are two questions that we start every one of our processes with. And that question is resilient to what? So what are the specific shocks and stresses that we are looking at, that we are examining, that we are pulling data for, and that we are trying to address and find solutions to? So in Vancouver, we face a pretty kind of high hazard profile, I would say. We have pretty extreme earthquake risk and have been very fortunate, knock on wood, for many years in that we haven't experienced a damaging earthquake in hundreds of years. But we know that it's coming. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We've also experienced oil spills. We're a coastal city and a port city in the past few years that were damaging. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to go full screen. Is that better for everybody? We have experienced industrial fires and accidents in recent years that were deeply troubling in terms of the impacts that they had on vulnerable communities. We regularly experience air quality advisories due to wildfire smoke, both in California as well as in the province of BC. And we experience droughts and heat waves. In addition to that, Vancouver faces a range of chronic stresses. Like many other cities in the world, we are dealing with aging infrastructure and real challenges within our city of being able to pay for upgrades. In addition to that, we have pretty serious housing affordability issues, chronic poverty, social isolation, sea level rise, and food insecurity. And we're also trying to grapple with this question of what are the trends that we need to think about. So much like David was saying, we're really trying to shift to what is the more long-term thinking that we need to take into account, and what are the trends that are going to change actually the landscape of how we need to think about shocks and stresses in the future. These include aging population, technological changes, the changing nature of work, and quite frankly, just a growing population. Our city is densifying at a rapid rate, and that is resulting in the urbanization of risk. So the second question that we always ask in these processes is resilient for whom? So who are we actually designing these solutions for? Who are the populations who are most impacted by the shocks and stresses that we're discussing? Disasters ultimately lay bare our deepest inequities, and we've seen that play out in Vancouver over the course of COVID in the last year. In order to do this work effectively, we also need to really look at what are the historical drivers of the socioeconomic vulnerabilities that we're seeing. And in many cases, this comes down to the exposure and vulnerability of the community. So the kind of simplest example of this that I can give is in 2015, we faced a port fire. So there was a shipping container in our port that was emitting toxic fumes. As a city, our response plan was to let people know that they needed to shelter indoors while we put out this fire and determined what the chemical was. Unfortunately, our port is also where a vast majority of our homeless population lives. And these people do not have homes or workplaces that they can go into to shelter in place. So that caused like some major response questions from our end on how do we actually need to get at some risk reduction methods around social equity rather than just driving at the physical kind of elements of our risk. Now, what is this looking like in Vancouver right now? We are really grappling with this question of data and risk and decision making. And I would say in Vancouver, there are certain hazards that we have incredibly rich risk assessments around. So sea level rise and flood, we have really rich data around this. We've done some pretty impressive assessments. We also are working on some really, really wonderful risk assessments around seismic risk for buildings specifically that a colleague of mine is leading. Where we're struggling though is we don't actually at the moment have a version of this where we can compare these hazards against one another. So we know that we have particular hazards that we're at high risk of, that we have particular risk reduction actions that we need to take. However, we need to actually find a way to examine those hazards against one another to understand what actually do our priorities need to be as a city. So recognizing that we have a very limited budget, especially right now in the face of COVID, and we need to really make sure that we're prioritizing the greatest risks, our hazards of greatest concern in our risk reduction actions in order to address them. And so one of the tools that we're using, one of the processes that we're using to do this is updating our hazard risk and vulnerability assessment. So this is a tool that is legislated for cities in British Columbia to complete. However, the last time that we updated this document, this risk assessment, was actually almost 15 years ago. So it's quite out of date. Now, our hazard risk and vulnerability assessment from almost 15 years ago did not take climate change projections into account. And that is something that we are doing through the process right now, is we're trying to look at not only what is the current state of risk that we face amongst all of these different hazards of greatest concern, but how is that risk profile going to change? What is the dynamic nature of our risk? And again, I'm echoing what David said really perfectly earlier. What's the dynamic nature of risk that we need to look at over time in our city? So this is some work that's ongoing. We're hoping to come up with this short list of hazards of greatest concern. And from there, we're looking to not only have workshops where we lay the maps and the data on the table for groups to actually do some risk ratings. We're also looking at creating narratives around each of these hazards so that we can really dig into and understand not just kind of the numerical spatial analysis, but also what's the more qualitative analysis we need to understand of how these hazards impact particular sectors, impact particular populations, particular neighborhoods. How can we tell that story in a really effective way so that we're not just speaking to the kind of, again, quantitative aspects of hazards, but we're also looking really at the qualitative experience that people would have in the event of that shock. Now, this is feeding into another process that we're going through right now, and that is looking at disaster risk reduction and resilience governance. So this is leading from some of the recommendations that came out of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and specifically understanding what's the continuum of action that we need to have in the city of Vancouver. The way we're looking at this right now is kind of looking from the immediate term. So what are the hazards that we actually need to prepare for today in terms of our emergency response plans, all the way through this continuum of what are the risk reduction actions that we need to take to mitigate and adapt to risks that are emerging on the horizon or things that may not hit us today or are only going to increase over time. So within this continuum, we look at sort of buildings and infrastructure as something that we need to start addressing today. However, we know it's going to take decades for us to actually fully address the risks that our buildings face, even just around seismic resilience. And then next up, we also want to make sure we're really considering and thinking about land use planning and zoning. So how can we make sure not only are we reducing our risk by hopefully moving some of our incredibly vulnerable infrastructure and buildings off of high-risk lands, but in addition to that, what can we make sure that we're doing to not actually increase our risk in the future, not create new risk by, say, building in a floodplain, for example. And then the last component of this, which I think is really exciting and we're just kind of starting to dabble in Vancouver, is starting to look at strategic foresight and scenario planning. So in addition to the really incredible data and mapping that we're doing around existing hazards, again, looking at that long-term, David mentioned this, but what is that 20, 30-year time horizon that we need to look to? And what are the emerging risks that we don't really think of today, but that might hit us in the future? And how do we prepare for those? How do we address those? And how do we actually make sure that we're leveraging opportunities that we see on the horizon too? The final piece I'll mention around this, around that hazard risk and vulnerability assessment, it is all well and good for us to do these assessments every 10 years. But again, because risk is dynamic, it actually is more important for us to invest in doing this work on an ongoing basis. So we're looking at what are the ways that we can shift some of the work we do so that we are collecting data, analyzing risk on an ongoing basis, and updating our plans and policies accordingly. This kind of dynamic measure of making sure that we're always checking where we're at with a particular hazard, with a particular risk, making sure we're moving the dial and making sure we're really identifying the changes that are happening as they're happening, not 10 years after the fact. Now, how does this feed into Resilient Vancouver, our strategy? So Resilient Vancouver, I want to make sure everyone is clear, is not the only strategy in our city that builds resilience. We're incredibly fortunate that Resilient Vancouver sits on this rich foundation of our healthy city strategy that looks at health and well-being and social resilience, our climate adaptation strategy, our Greenest City Action Plan and Climate Emergency Action Plan, as well as an earthquake preparedness strategy that is now sunsetting, with Resilient Vancouver kind of taking over many of the earthquake components of that. There's rich work that we have to build on, and Resilient Vancouver was also fortunate to get to engage with multiple stakeholders from all different communities and all different sectors in order to create the actions that I'm going to share with you now. So as Lauren mentioned at the beginning, our strategy is structured around 3 priority areas: thriving and prepared neighborhoods. This is sort of the people component of our work. Proactive and collaborative city. So this is how we as an organization can actually be more adaptive, more proactive. And then last but certainly not least, safe and adaptive buildings and infrastructure. So what's the built environment piece of this equation? In terms of people, the reason why we went in this direction was that people and neighborhoods are ultimately who are experiencing shocks and stresses. Neighborhoods are where shocks play out in the community, and it's usually where people seek services to find support for the stresses that they're facing. Communities are also the first to come up with innovative grassroots solutions to the pressing challenges that they're facing. So from a disaster standpoint, we know that social infrastructure, so community centers and libraries, these are the places where people seek services day to day. And they are also critical to making sure that community is cared for during a crisis. People go to the places that they trust when they are trying to find help. So in terms of the actions that we came up with for our strategy in this area, there are sort of 3 ones that actually directly connect into that data and risk and decision making. The first is working on launching what was a pilot and is now hopefully going to be an ongoing program, a Resilient Neighborhoods program. So this is a partnership with community-based organizations, our social infrastructure, as I mentioned, on how we can knit together emergency preparedness, climate action, and social connection work, recognizing that while we as the city have departments that look at each of these separately, community actually sees these as all part of the same picture. And so how can we have kind of more an umbrella that community can actually engage with, where they get to sort of work on all of these challenges at once? In addition to that, we're also looking at the tail end of the HRVA on turning this work into a digital open portal. We're looking at an Esri story map, for example, as one of our options that connects people not only to really important risk information that they need to know and visualizes it in a spatial way, but also that connects them to preparedness guides that accompany that risk information. So a bit of a kind of one-stop shop idea. We're not just telling people about the problem, we're also giving them the answers and the solutions at the same time. And then last, but certainly not least, I think some of the most interesting work that's come out of the Resilient strategy, and I don't know if there's anyone from Melbourne on this call right now, but you were our inspiration for this, is looking at a program much like Refuge, which is in Melbourne. So this is an artist-led activation around disaster preparedness and response. We were lucky enough to have folks from Melbourne come to Vancouver and share their own process with us. And essentially what it amounted to was bringing together local artists in Vancouver, Indigenous wisdom holders, scientists, emergency managements, urban planners, all together in the same room to learn kind of both about the sort of scientific view of a particular hazard and a risk, and then work collaboratively with artists to actually play with what are the creative solutions that we can come up with, both on how to prepare for this event and also how we might need to respond to it collectively as a community. This particular action for me gets at something that I think is sometimes missing from our risk communication. We often, again, communicate kind of in terms of like our quantitative metrics and our projections. This doesn't always resonate with people. And so we've really tried to figure out what are the kind of different ways, more creative ways that we can engage in conversations with our community about the risks that we face, that can instill hope, that can empower people to actually act, and can ultimately make this a bit more fun so that we get more buy-in from people to actually want to participate in these sorts of discussions. Now, the next pillar of our strategy is on our organization. So again, we as an organization are not going to do a very good job of building resilience if we don't actually look at our own internal resilience first. So what are the things that we need to do as an organization? Well, first of all, we really need to look at how we prioritize equity in our planning work. In the words of two colleagues from the Resilient Cities Network, Stuart and Ron, there is no resilience without equity. So we need to focus on how we kind of address that within the city of Vancouver, both internally with our own staff, as well as how we have a relationship with our community members. Next up, we also need to strengthen hazard and risk governance. So I mentioned this earlier, and I'm bringing it back to that. As per the guidance in the Sendai framework, disaster risk governance is one of the key things that we as cities can do to try and improve our disaster risk reduction efforts. If we are not all collectively within a municipality sort of working in lockstep, working together, sharing information, understanding the problem that we face, or the problems we face collectively, then it's really challenging for us to work together on solutions. And then last, but certainly not least, we were really looking at how can we improve the agility of our leadership. And so COVID was a really challenging test for us in understanding how can we make sure that our decisions are more dynamic, that as we face new challenges, we're actually able to adapt and change ourselves as an organization. And one of the ways that we're again looking at doing this is through that strategic foresight pillar that I mentioned. Now, the specific actions in this area include implementing hazard modeling tools to reduce risk. So much of this is happening through our seismic work for buildings, our climate adaptation work, of trying to understand what are the hazards we face. The HRVA is pulling all of these pieces together so that we can layer and look at them as one. And once we have that together, what do we need to understand for our land use, zoning, and urban design? And how can we actually design a city that is fundamentally resilient just by the way it's been built, as opposed to having one that is always trying to account for a hazard after the fact? In addition to that, we're also really trying to focus on this idea of disaster risk reduction and resilience governance. Again, at the city, like most cities in the world, we have lots of departmental silos, and we need to kind of work to break those down a little so we can work around resilience and disaster risk reduction and prioritize sort of at a corporate level. And finally in this, of course, we need to really examine our financial resilience. So recognizing that at the moment, our buildings and infrastructure are aging. We are facing an increasing gap in what we are able to actually pay for in terms of new designs. But the major gap for us actually comes from we're not really able to retrofit our existing buildings and infrastructure in a financially feasible way. So what do we need to do to get there? And how do we make sure that we have a sustainable financial model for the future? And last, in terms of the pillars of our strategy, I'm almost at the end, is our built environment. So we need to, again, make sure that we're actually designing buildings and infrastructure that are able to withstand and adapt to multiple challenges and changes, shocks and stresses. We also want to understand how do we strategically upgrade our civic facilities, both thinking of our actual offices for city staff, our works yards for operations, and our civic facilities that are for community, like community centers and libraries. What do we need to do first? Which of these facilities need to be prioritized, and how do we prioritize them? In addition to that, we're also looking at how we can, again, understand our shared risks better. So wanting to make sure that as we gather and develop more information about the risks that we face, how do we make sure we mainstream that in the organization? So it isn't just a handful of resilience planners that hold this information, but that it's actually just embedded in all of the work we do. The actions around this part of our strategy include the completion of a seismic risk assessment for buildings and identification of risk reduction and policy options. So wanting to kind of categorize this across what do we need to do for new buildings that haven't been built yet? What's the building bylaw that we need to have? How do we make sure that we're retrofitting buildings and prioritizing those retrofits to the buildings that are kind of the highest risk, the highest damage levels that we're expecting? And also, how do we make sure that we form cross-departmental groups so that we're not just, again, talking about these issues single hazard in silos. And this is work that one of my colleagues has led to bring together a resilient buildings governance model. So this integrates seismic considerations for buildings, climate considerations for buildings, and our affordability policy, all as a group to make sure that we're packaging these things, understanding the co-benefits and trade-offs all together when we advance policy. And then thirdly, developing a framework for critical infrastructure management and decision-making. So at the moment, similar to how we're looking at buildings, we need to come to a point where we understand the risks we face, we're prioritizing the actions we're taking, we're prioritizing the investments that we're making in which infrastructure might need to be upgraded first. And much of that is actually going to come from us actually establishing recovery targets. So not just understanding what's the kind of risk tolerance we have with our infrastructure, but what needs to come back online first. And what do we make sure is our minimum standard, minimum threshold for service levels? So just to wrap up and summarize, like I said, Vancouver hasn't figured out all the answers, but we're kind of, we're trying to take some of the best practices into account in our work. We are in our next steps completing our hazard risk and vulnerability assessment and trying to specifically identify what does this process need to look like if it were to be done on an ongoing basis and that data were to be updated and managed and risk assessments redone on an ongoing basis. We're also really looking at this concept of disaster risk reduction and resilience governance. So trying to align departmental work and also our decision-making processes and criteria. And then last, but certainly not least, again, aligning city funding and priorities to address the greatest risks that we face. So kind of building on the risk assessment, the governance itself, and then trying to align our finances together to reduce our risk. That's all I have. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Katya. You keep repeating that you don't have all the answers, but I must say I've rarely seen such a comprehensive strategy for a city, and I've seen quite a few. I've been working for 20 years in this field for the World Bank. So really congratulations. Also I mean, I really think it's impressive how you've been thinking about the interaction between the different elements of such a strategy. We very often see people working in silo and not realizing that you can't think about how you retrofit building without thinking about the cost of it and affordability, and maybe you want to integrate climate change in what they're doing. And I must say, I really like your Thriving and Prepared Neighborhood program. And you were right to say that neighborhoods are the ground zero of resilience. We like to say the cities are in the front line, but the truth is that really neighborhoods are really the ultimate front line. Amazing that you were inspired by Melbourne, which is probably the furthest city on earth from Vancouver. That says something about the benefits of globalization and network like RCN and the Resilient Cities program of the bank, and also how you use art and humor. In fact, that's something we've really tried to push through our Understanding Risk forum. And if you guys are interested, I would encourage people to go online and look at the Understanding Risk webpage. There's quite a lot of example there. We can come back to all of these elements, but I wanted to start with the first question for David. David, you presented, the standard risk modeling technique. You talked about dynamic models. I want to come to that. You talked about high frequencies versus black swan, consequence-driven analysis, celebrating disaster. I also want to come back. I'm not sure we'll have time, but I've so many interesting questions. But on this dynamic model, work you're doing on dynamic model, you talk about the different elements that make risk evolve. Particularly hazards are evolving, but also vulnerabilities and also assets exposed. Could you tell us a little bit about, in your experience, what are the main drivers really of risk, and kind of how do you try to recommend interventions? Where do you think are the lowest hanging fruit in intervening to try to address the dynamic aspects of risk? And then maybe we can come back to you, Katya, and what are the main drivers of risk in Vancouver, not the existing one, but in the growth of risk and maybe a link with you mentioned that you're working on strategic foresight. I think this kind of work is always fascinating, but I'm always struggling to choose what actual foresight risk you work on, because if you ask me, I can list 20 risks for every city I work in, and it's very hard to choose which one you are going to work on, and there are many sometimes reasons for it. So over to you, David. I've been way too long.
Thank you, Francis, for that question, and thank you, Katya, for the fascinating presentation. I have a bunch of questions for you too, actually. But so you asked about kind of the drivers of risk and the main drivers of risk, and I kind of generically mentioned, changing hazards, mostly from climate change. And actually, what I found particularly interesting about also focusing on changing exposure and changing vulnerability is actually most people think about climate change as the main driver for changing risk, and I think that's definitely not necessarily the case, or at least there isn't enough evidence of that. But also, exposure and vulnerability is what we have most control over. And if you look at cities, particularly kind of unplanned cities, which unfortunately constitutes probably the majority of cities out there, as they get larger and larger, there's more incentive to occupy more and more hazardous land. And we've seen this in cities across the world where, the safest land gets used first, and then it incrementally gets worse and worse. So in fact, I think there's, we could believe that the risk is increasing more rapidly than the population. And then likewise with vulnerability, I think we would like to believe that we're getting smarter in how we build, and that the way that we build today is safer than it was before. I also think, cities and the networks that we rely on are increasingly complex and have interconnectivities that we often don't account for when we think about risk, and that introduces vulnerabilities as well. And so I think it's really important to look at those two drivers of risk as well, because those are the ones that, like I said, I think we have much more control over, compared to climate, which certainly we do have control over, but not at the scale of a city, of a single city. Not sure if that answers your question properly.
You did, David. I think you're right that the drivers we have controlled on are also very important. I think where people build, the fact that they keep building more and more, and we see this all over in the developing world. At least there's more control in the more advanced economies, even though there, I think we're not always very good at controlling and guiding constructions in the safer place with the right standards. But I'm curious to hear, Katya, and what you're doing about that in Vancouver, and then maybe if you can say a few words about how you do strategic foresight.
Sure. Yeah, we're in really early stages of the strategic foresight work, but we've actually been rolling this out through our citywide planning process. So we're developing a citywide plan. Here it's called an official community plan, for the first time in about 100 years. And as part of that, we've been working with some wonderful consultants to develop some 2050 scenarios. And we're using those scenarios to test our policies against them and kind of do some wind tunneling so that we can understand, okay, if these are addressing the problems that we face today, how might they address or hinder or exacerbate the challenges that we might face in 2050? So that's kind of the way that we're doing that work at the moment. In addition to that, I think your other question was around what are the drivers of risk in Vancouver, the major drivers of risk. I think I could muse on this for a long time, but I would say one of the key challenges that we face here is just kind of growing socioeconomic inequity. There are many people in our community who are kind of forced to live in risky conditions. And the example of that I'll give is unreinforced masonry buildings in our downtown east side. So these are the buildings that house most of the people in our community who are living in chronic poverty. They are not seismically retrofitted in most cases, and they're also not retrofitted for climate events. So whether we're talking about an earthquake or whether we're talking about a heat wave and an air quality advisory, the people living in those buildings don't actually have the protection they need to withstand those events. And so I think a key driver of our risk is ultimately how can we shift from, or sorry, maybe not a key driver of our risk. One of the things that we need to do here is we really need to start embedding this type of thinking into all of our planning and policy work. It's not really good enough to say the building won't collapse and kill you, which is what our current building standard says. It says the building is not going to fall down. But it doesn't actually mean it's serviceable afterwards. And so when we look at some of our earthquake projections, one of the things that we see is just massive displacement. And there's actually nowhere that we can actually house most of the population that would be displaced. So these are the kinds of things that we actually just need to make that part of the way that we do our thinking, the way that we develop our policies, because we know that these events are going to happen sooner or later. And if we don't reduce our risk now, then we're going to face incredible social, economic, and physical costs down the road.
Not sure if we can sneak in one more question, but let's try in the time that we have, because there are so many good ones that come up. So I want to come back to the risk continuum that you talked about, Katya. And I think in your work, you also talked about different kinds of risk, David, over time. And the question comes not from the furthest city away from you, Katya, but from a much closer city, from Amy in Toronto. And, you know, she asks, I think, a very poignant question, which is a lot of people are very comfortable with risk and emergency response and those short-term kinds of planning efforts and relief efforts. What are the levers, right, that you can really use to get people to move across that continuum? And where do you see opportunities to do that in a compelling way? And David, you know, I would ask the same question to you. Where do you see people really picking this up and taking it more seriously? Katya, maybe we'll come to you first and then to David.
There we go. Yeah, so one of the ways that I've seen this change happen in real time in our strategy work was through both our Resilient Neighborhoods program as well as through that kind of creative lab on disaster resilience that we did. So within our Resilient Neighborhoods program, we spent about 3 years working very, very closely on co-creating some tools and resources with our community partners. And while we were doing that, we started from this point of just asking the question, what does resilience mean to you? What are the shocks and stresses you're most concerned about? And when we asked those questions, it was really fascinating to, throughout the process, ask that question again and again and again, and see how much it changed over that 3-year period. What we noticed was what came up in that first discussion was honestly what was in the news that particular month. You know, people referenced the things that were coming up really immediately. So to speak to your point, Amy, hi, Amy, it was really focused on like, what are the things that we're experiencing in this moment today? And it wasn't so much looking at the long term. Climate change was actually really low on people's radar in that first year. We did that in 2017. Fast forward to the launch of the IPCC report, and suddenly everybody in our community network wanted to talk about climate change as the shock and stress they were most concerned about. So I think, you know, some of the way that we get at those conversations is a bit opportunistic, to be completely honest. But the other way that it happens is through kind of honestly just those repeated engagements over and over again. That changed that message over time and really changed also our opinion and our perspective as city staff workers, as resilience practitioners. We kind of also kind of came a lot closer to where community was at in that dialogue. And then the other part being the creative lab on resilience. I think that is the strongest example I can think of where I've seen a really fast change in how people were grappling with these issues. And the credit I'll give to that is not only by engaging artists in this conversation, by using storytelling to talk about risk instead of just looking at kind of facts and figures, but understanding also that stories in and of themselves are data. But we also invited Indigenous matriarchs to share stories of deep time. So they were speaking from this experience of 7-generation planning and really like living on these lands since time immemorial. And through that perspective, we found the rest of the group, the non-Indigenous folks in the rooms, were really starting to kind of move closer and closer to looking at those really long-term projections through the way that these Indigenous matriarchs were framing the conversation.
Hi, I'll quickly jump in to add. I completely agree with everything that Katya said. And I think it's really important. I mean, I think in our work, this idea of celebrating successes is really to try to shift the benefits that might only be felt in the medium or long term to shift it to today, that we should celebrate today, so, the benefits that perhaps we'll only see in the future. But also Katya at one point mentioned kind of the importance of understanding co-benefits. And I think that's also key. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to not only understand co-benefits, but design interventions for co-benefits so that we can have short-term and immediate benefits as well as these medium and long-term benefits. And I think that makes it a lot more exciting to communities. And then really, I really appreciated all these comments about the importance of narrative and the importance of instilling hope. And I think there are other ways that we can really bring these things to the fore and help people move on this continuum as well.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Katya. I think those are really poignant notes to end on. Thank you both for being storytellers and for sharing your experiences with us. I think that's an extremely powerful example of how we can continue to move the conversation forward. So again, thank you both for being with us tonight. On behalf of Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank, thanks to everyone who's called in tonight. We'll be back not next week and not the week after, but in 3 weeks' time, speaking about resilient infrastructure. So I hope that we'll see and hear from many of you again at that time. And until then, be safe, be healthy, take care. Good night from Singapore.
Good night. Thank you, Katya. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, guys.